In 1991, a team of divers pulled 5 wrecked Navy bombers from the seabed off the coast of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. For a moment, the world believed a 46-year-old mystery was finally over. It wasn't. Because none of those 5 planes were the ones anyone was looking for. 6 aircraft. 27 men. Gone in under 4 hours, on a routine afternoon, for months after the Second World War had already ended. Nothing about that day has ever been fully explained. December 5, 1945. Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale. The war had been over since August. The base was still full of trainees, young men finishing out their flight hours on missions that, by now, carried none of the danger of the years before. At the front of that afternoon's exercise was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, 28 years old, verify age, a combat-experienced pilot who had flown in the Pacific. Taylor knew airplanes. He did not, by most accounts, know this stretch of Florida coastline especially well, verify. Some sources note he was relatively new to instructing this specific route. Under his command that day, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, 14 men total. Mostly students. Mostly young. 3-man crews in 4 of the planes, 2 men in the 5th, verify exact crew distribution. The mission had a name that sounded almost bureaucratic, Navigation Problem Number 1. A training triangle, out over the Bahamas for a bombing run on a wrecked ship used as a target, then a turn north, then a long leg back to the mainland. The kind of flight that had been flown by other squadrons dozens of times before. They took off at 2 in the afternoon. Clear skies. Standard fuel load, enough for roughly 4 hours in the air. They were expected home before sunset. Nothing about the morning briefing suggested this flight would be any different from the ones before it. It was. The bombing run went as planned. Flight 19 reached its target near the Bahamas, dropped its ordnance, and turned to begin the flight home. Then something went wrong. Taylor radioed the tower that his compasses appeared to be malfunctioning. He believed the squadron was somewhere over the Florida Keys, roughly 200 miles from where flight instructors later calculated they actually were, verify distance figure. At least one of the junior pilots in the formation suggested flying west, toward the sun, toward the mainland. Taylor held course northeast instead. That decision took 5 planes further out over open Atlantic water, not back toward land. Through the afternoon, the weather turned. Wind picked up. The sea below grew rougher. At 5:50 p.m., radio triangulation from the base placed the squadron within 50 nautical miles of a fixed point roughly 79 degrees west, 29 degrees north. The transmissions that came after grew shorter and harder to make out. At one point, Taylor's voice came through. "We'll have to ditch unless landfall, when the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." Real quote, verify exact wording against Navy radio transcript before using verbatim on camera. Radio contact with Flight 19 was lost at 7:04 p.m. 5 planes. 14 men. Gone. Within minutes of losing contact, 2 PBM Mariner flying boats were scrambled from Naval Air Station Banana River to search for the missing squadron. One of them, callsign Training 49, verify callsign, checked in with the tower roughly 10 minutes into its flight. It never transmitted again. A merchant ship in the area, the SS Gaines Mills, later reported seeing a fireball in the night sky, and finding an oil slick on the water at close to the time and position the Mariner would have been flying, verify ship name and captain, spelled inconsistently across sources. It's worth knowing something about the PBM Mariner here. The aircraft had a documented history of fuel vapor explosions, common enough that crews nicknamed them flying gas tanks. The fireball wasn't a mystery. It was, most likely, exactly what it looked like. By morning, the search had grown into one of the largest air and sea operations of its kind, hundreds of aircraft, hundreds of ships, in some accounts nearly 300 vessels and close to 500 planes, covering an estimated 250,000 square miles of ocean over the next 5 days. Verify exact figures, sources vary. They found nothing. No wreckage. No life rafts. No debris field. Not even an oil slick from the Avengers themselves, a detail searchers found almost as unsettling as the disappearance itself, given the scale of the effort. They searched an area larger than most countries. They found nothing at all. Which meant the question stopped being what happened to Flight 19, and became something harder to answer: how do you lose 6 aircraft and 27 men, and leave behind no trace whatsoever? The Navy's Board of Inquiry initially attributed the loss to pilot error, Taylor's disorientation, his refusal to change course. Taylor's mother, Catherine Taylor, petitioned the Navy and conducted her own investigation into her son's death. The finding was eventually revised. The official cause, to this day, reads simply, "cause unknown." The myth versus the facts. In the years after 1945, Flight 19 stopped being a Navy training accident and became something else entirely. The term Bermuda Triangle itself didn't exist yet in 1945, it was coined by writer Vincent Gaddis in 1964, nearly 20 years after the squadron vanished. Verify year and attribution. The myth, in other words, was built backward, onto an event that had already happened. Legend, not factual, one version of the story, repeated for decades, claims Taylor's final transmission included the words, "They look like they're from outer space, don't come after us." No such transmission exists in any recorded log. It was invented by magazine writers years later, and it has been retold as fact ever since. Legend, in 1977, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind opened with the 5 Avengers of Flight 19 discovered intact in the Mexican desert, abducted, and quietly returned, by extraterrestrials. It's a striking opening scene. It is also, entirely, fiction. And then there's the 1991 Discovery, the one this story opened on. Treasure hunters located 5 TBM Avengers on the seafloor off Fort Lauderdale, and for a brief moment, headlines around the world declared the mystery solved. Verify press coverage details. It wasn't. When investigators checked the serial numbers against Navy service records, the wreckage belonged to a different squadron entirely, 5 other Avengers, lost in a different incident, that happened to be resting in roughly the same stretch of ocean. Strip away the aliens. Strip away the movie. Strip away the 1991 headline that turned out to be wrong. What's left is simpler, and in its own way, sadder: a malfunctioning compass, a confident pilot who trusted his instinct over his instruments, worsening weather, and a fuel gauge that eventually reached zero. That is the theory the evidence best supports, not proof, but the closest thing the record allows. Where the trail ends. As of today, no wreckage from Flight 19, or from the mariner sent to find it, has ever been conclusively identified. Verify this is still current before final recording. Researchers have kept looking. Aviation historian John Meyer spent more than 3 decades investigating possible crash sites, and has proposed specific locations over the years. Verify claims are presented as claims, not confirmed fact. None has been confirmed by the Navy. Trail ends beat, the official record has not changed since the week the Navy closed its file. Cause unknown. It is the same answer it was 80 years ago. 14 men in 5 airplanes, and 13 more in the plane sent to find them, remain, in the most literal sense, unaccounted for. The ocean has never given up what it took that afternoon in December. End.